All right. Good morning, everybody. This is Audrey Kidwell with Volunteer Florida. You are here for the 11:30 session on preparing volunteers, orientation, and training. Really excited to have the United Way of Palm Beach County joining us today to talk about their many aspects of their volunteer program. So we have Donna Polda, Gary Graham, Megan Foley, and Vivian Pashmina on the call today. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Hope you've been enjoying the convening so far. So as Audrey said, today we'll be presenting on orienting and training volunteers. So as Audrey said, here's our team. I'm Donna Polda, Vice President of Volunteer Services. Megan Foley is our Associate Director of Disaster Recovery. Vivian Pazmino is our VITA Program Director. And Gary Graham is our Senior Director of our Mentoring Initiative. So as we go through our presentation today, you'll notice the 8 volunteer management practices, and we will reference a couple of those throughout the presentation, but obviously focusing on the orienting and training volunteers. So orienting and training volunteers, what's the difference? So with orientation, you're basically giving all of the information about your organization. So your mission, your vision, if you have any focus areas that your organization has, so like homelessness or housing or education. So your orientation is basically going to focus on all of the things relative to your organization and who you help in the community. So your training is basically going to provide the knowledge, skills, and attitudes that your volunteers will need to effectively perform their roles and their duties. And one of the important things to remember about orienting and training volunteers is that each volunteer should have a position description. And so we do have a handout with a blank position description for you that you can use as a template. So the importance of training volunteers, it gives the volunteers the ability to perform their duties successfully, provides the volunteers, again, with the skills, knowledge, and attitude, and you'll see we'll reference that throughout the presentation this morning. It gives the volunteers a feeling of being a part of the team. It provides volunteers with a clear understanding of the organization and their role in the community, and it keeps volunteers motivated. So knowledge, skills, and attitudes. So what is that? So we want to increase the volunteer's knowledge. So you want to increase the amount of information your volunteer has to successfully perform their role. You want to increase their skills, so increasing your volunteer's ability to perform their tasks, and change attitudes, so change the way your volunteer feels about an issue. So one of the important things too to remember when you're training volunteers is to also train your staff, because as you know, staff can be resistant to volunteers. They may feel that they don't have the time to work with the volunteer, to really show them what they need them to do. They might be a little weary about a volunteer taking over their role. So you want to involve your staff right from the very beginning. So you want to involve them in writing that position description. You want to involve them in the recruiting and the interviewing. And as you noticed in the 8 volunteer management practices, recruiting is one of those management practices. And then you want to involve them, to make their job just easier. So one of the things I always ask staff is, what do you like least about your job? Or what is the one thing about your job, if you didn't have to do, what would that be? And then sometimes the light bulb will just go off and they'll be like, oh, wow. So a volunteer could help me do that. So you really want to get your staff on board right from the beginning to make everything run smoothly and make it have a successful program. So the importance of orienting your volunteers. So as we said, the importance is to inform the volunteer about your mission, your vision, your organization, all the things that you do in the community, all of your programs. And it provides the description of the roles and the tasks that the volunteer will be performing. And it explains really what is important to the community. And so the issues and things that we're trying to alleviate, that we're trying to help our agencies with. And then it also provides your volunteers with any kind of safety precautions that they need to make sure that they're aware of while they're performing their role. And then any, if you have any kind of policies, procedures, you want to go through all of those with your volunteers. And it definitely is important for any well-run volunteer program, as most of you may know, to have those policies and procedures in place. So that would be something that you want to make sure that you have in place before you even start your volunteer program and recruiting. So one of the other things on those 8 volunteer management practices is recognition. So when you're orienting and training volunteers, you're recruiting volunteers, you don't want to have to keep going through that process over and over and over again. That can get really tiring. So you want to try to retain your volunteers. So one of the things you can do to retain your volunteers, obviously, as most of you probably know, is recognition. And recognition doesn't have to be some big event, some grandioso, award. A lot of volunteers sometimes just like that pat on the back. You're doing a great job. Thank you for everything you're doing. And if you have a lot of older volunteers in your program, the old snail mail, they like to just get that little thank you card in the mail. It really makes them feel special when they open up that little card that says thank you for what you've done for our organization. So definitely you want to make sure along the way that you're recognizing your volunteers, thanking them for all that they do, and then you don't have to continue that process of constantly recruiting and orienting and training over and over again. So 3 of the programs that we have through United Way of Palm Beach County is our mentoring program. And then we have our VITA program, which is the Volunteer Income Tax Assistance Program, which provides the free tax prep. And then our disaster recovery program. So Megan and Vivian and Gary will be talking to you about those. But before we move on, if anybody has any questions or if any have been posted in the chat, we could take a few minutes to answer any questions that anybody may have.
I don't see any questions at the moment.
Okay, so great. So I am going to hand it over to Gary Graham now. So he will give you some information about the different ways that we train our mentoring volunteers.
All right. Good morning. So we're going to go a little bit into the mentoring. And the first thing that we're going to talk about, let me get my full screen first. There we go. Okay. So before the orientation and training can even take place, all mentors are screened via a level 2 background check. Once the background check is successfully obtained, mentors are provided with an in-depth orientation. And during this 2-hour orientation, mentors are provided with a few different things. One is the overview of the program in general. So within the 60 programs we have here in Palm Beach County, they all do different things. Some use mentoring as an intervention for kids on the autism spectrum. Some use it as an intervention for girls who are parenting or actually pregnant in high school. So you get an overview of the program and the type of mentoring that's going to be used in that program. One of the last things is the boundaries and parameters of their mentoring. For each of the 3 different mentorings that we're going to go into today, you'll see that there's different boundaries in how in depth the mentor can go with the mentee. But also for this, I wanted to point out that mentoring is a good way for, in terms of training and orientation, is a good example of the volunteer increasing their knowledge But one of the things I also thought about is actually a great way for volunteers to increase their skills in dealing with the youth and also change the attitude about the youth that they're dealing with. Some mentors may come into a mentoring relationship with these ideas about the youth in their community, but they may be far off and you just realize they're just regular kids just like you used to be. So this is one of the types of mentorings. Go to full again. Sorry. Having some difficulty with my screen. It's going to be down here. Okay, so the first one is the school-based orientation and training. Oh, no, I went too far. There we go. So first we have the types of mentoring. So there's 3 different types of mentoring that we really decide which types of programs are good for the youth. So it went back again.
Oh. Sorry, it's skipping my slide. I don't know why it's going back and forth.
Yeah, I just wanted there we go. Okay, the first one is the school-based mentoring. And this happens on a school campus. You meet with the child during the school day, usually at lunchtime. This is the least flexible type of program. You meet at a designated spot, usually in the cafeteria or the library, and then you meet with your mentee. So there is very little variance about where you could go on school campus. It keeps going back. The next is the site-based type of program. This is typically at an after-school program location, usually like a Boys and Girls Club. And the next is a community-based mentoring program. So the first one that we'll go into is a school-based orientation and training. So there will be no direct contact with the student outside of school grounds. So you may happen to see them in a grocery store, wherever it may be in the community at large, but you will not have any planned contact with your mentee outside of school grounds. The second thing is the mentors must have a school-issued badge allowing them to access the school and the mentee. So part of that level 2 background check that they do will allow them to get a school-issued ID badge that they must be worn at all times when they're meeting with the student on campus. Mentors must sign into the main office and wait for the mentee or be escorted to the meeting place, library, cafeteria, or classroom, either by another student or by another official on campus. Once the meeting is done with your mentee, the mentors must report back to the main office and sign out. If the virtual mentoring is taking place like it is now, all communication must take place through a virtual mentoring platform. The reason this is done is to make sure that there's nothing inappropriate going on at all, and that virtual mentoring platform also monitors and flags specific words by the mentor or mentee that may deem inappropriate. And the mentors must enter or match notes into that software as well about how often they met, when they met, and then if there's anything to note during that meeting, they will also talk about that. Okay. So also, during the training of the school-based mentoring program, the boundaries training will be conducted to ensure mentor is provided with the tools to handle difficult situations, such as mentee informs a mentor that their lights may have been shut off or that they have no money for lunch. Other issues that may come up is a student may inform the mentor that they may want to harm or hurt themselves or somebody else, and that's another issue that we'll be going through in the training and orientation. As going upon that, the child abuse training and reporting is also mandatory. People need to understand that as a mentor, you are a mandatory reporter, so you have to be able to understand and be able to handle any situation that comes up with your mentee. Another one that is really big is the trauma-informed training. So when we're talking about changing attitudes, this is one of the things that we're talking about is a trauma-informed training. This provides mentor with an understanding of how trauma affects their mentees. So instead of saying that your mentee is acting out for no reason, they may have just had a traumatic experience that now produces itself like this. And lastly, agencies will provide any specific program training that may be required. So if an agency sees that 6 or 7 mentors are having the same issue, they will create or find a training that they can provide to their mentors to help solve that issue. So the next thing that we have is the site-based orientation and training. So just like the school-based program, there will be no direct contact with a student outside of the facility. Once again, you may see your student at a grocery store or someplace random in the community, bowling alley, but there is no direct contact with a student outside of that facility. Just like the school-based mentoring program at the site-based, the mentors must check in at the front desk of the facility before meeting with their mentee. Most of the time, at like the Boys and Girls Club, there will be a front desk that everybody checks into and checks out of. It checks in the students and also checks out the mentors. Mentors and mentees can meet indoors or outdoors within the facility, but they must be within the sight of staff. Mentors must not escort children to restroom, and mentors should utilize the staff restrooms when available, and they will be clearly marked. The mentor must enter match notes once again into the software. So just like the school-based program, there's a lot of parameters, but there's a lot more flexibility in the site-based mentoring program to where you can actually go into a computer lab, help the students with their homework, go play basketball, or even plant flowers in the community garden that some programs have. The next one is the community-based orientation and training. So the community-based program is the one that allows for the most flexibility. So this is where the mentor and mentee meet out in the community at large, or where the mentor will actually pick up the student from their house. So with this one, there will be lots more besides of the level 2 background check. There'll be a DMV check, an insurance check, and a driver's license check, just to make sure the mentor is in good standing and is able to transport their mentee. So, but once again, there'll be no direct contact outside of that meeting time in the regular scheduled meeting times with their mentee. And you still, once again, may see them in the community at large just by chance. The mentor must confirm meeting with the mentee 48 hours prior to scheduled meeting or pickup. This is going to be difficult sometimes because some of our mentees are not the best at communicating with our mentors. So we add that as an additional training for our mentors about communication and how to communicate with your mentees. And most of the time we will tell all of our mentors that you are the adult and the onus is on you to really try to continue that communication with the mentee, because a lot of times the mentees may give you the one-word answers, yes, no, I don't know, not good. So you really have to try over and above to really communicate with your mentee, specifically about them meeting specific measurements for meeting time and places being consistent with how they're communicating with you. And believe it or not, a lot of mentees will not really remember their meeting days and times. It is very common. The mentor must follow any specific program guidelines, and the mentor, once again, as you see with all of our mentoring programs, they must enter all of their match notes into that mentoring software. Any questions?
Yeah, there was a question. Someone wanted to know on how you obtain funding for a level 2 background check.
Okay, good question. We have funding from our funder. We have a large grant that we provide to provide funding for our mentoring programs. As you know, we have 50 programs on our network, but we fund 23 mentoring programs within Palm Beach County, and we write that into our funding. We also look for smaller grants to use to provide funding for those background checks. So we have our own background live scan machine that we use to screen our mentors. We also have several background check providers throughout the county that we can use at any given point. And I also see that the level 2 check, there's a question mark about that. So basically what a level 2 background check is a fingerprint check. It's not where you run it just the name or social security check. It's where you actually do the fingerprint. And it checks the local, state, and federal background criminal records. And it also does Interpol checks. So that is a official level 2 background check.
Did you want to mention the importance of the software and keeping notes?
Sure. my computer's. Can you hear me? Okay, good. So what we have for all of our agencies, we have this new software that we use called Innovative Mentoring Software. So what this software allows programs to do is it keeps notes, client level data on all of their mentors and mentees. It also allows the mentors to go into that software and enter all the notes about every mentoring meeting that they've had with their mentee. So they would go into the software, they'd enter a couple notes. You know, I met Sunday with Susie. We went to the art studio. We had ice cream afterwards, and everything is going great. So that is a software that allows everything to see. So you see a history of the mentor, the mentee, and the progress of that mentoring match. And if there's any issues that should have been red flags that you could take care of. So that is our mentoring software that we use. Good question. Any other questions? All right.
Okay, and I will mention that best practice is to rescreen your mentors at least every 5 years, because you just want to make sure, you know, anything can happen in between, and that you're keeping up on those background checks and making sure that nothing has popped up within that time frame. So, and that's one of the requirements, as Gary had said, through our funder, is to do the background checks every 5 years. And then I will also mention that we find from a lot of our mentors that they say they get more out of the program than they really even thought or that they realized when they signed up to be a mentor. So they think that they're coming in, they're going to help this child, they're going to change the child's life. But really, we hear from a lot of our mentors how it's changed their life so much from what they've done. And so our logo and our motto for our mentor program is change 2 lives. And so it's changing both the mentor and the mentee. And so again, going back to those skills, knowledge, and attitudes. So we're definitely changing the attitude of our mentors. So now I'm going to turn it over to Vivian, and she's going to tell you about how we train our volunteer income tax volunteers.
Hello, everyone. I'm very excited. This is my first time being a presenter in a webinar, especially right now with the pandemic and to avoid the spread of the COVID-19. Volunteer income tax system was implemented by the Internal Revenue Services to provide and support free tax preparation. As the name of the program itself says, volunteer. Volunteers are the key component of our program. That's why United Way, every year, around October, November, and December, we start with the recruitment for the program. We train and then we assign them to a different location that we have in the county through Palm Beach County. This program is being very successful in the last few years. We want our volunteers to provide the best quality service and the highest ethical standard. The benefits of being a VITA volunteer is to learn new skills, to network with community, with agencies, to get some community continuing education credits, and to have a rewarding experience. Who can be a volunteer for our program? Anyone, any profession. We have students from high school, from universities. We have tax professionals like, CPA, tax attorneys, enroll agents, and so on. And it could be a homemaker that want to give back to the community. And of course, just they're willing to help others to follow the policy of the program and, give us the best to the community in general, And of course, during the recruitment process, all our VITA volunteers have to complete and return a volunteer profile. It's pretty much like not an application, but to have, their information. And of course, what type of volunteer they want to do. And of course, pick a role. They want to be a greeter, or they want to be a tax preparer, or they want to be a coordinator. As soon as they send us to us, they have to have proof of citizenship. And of course, if they're no citizen of United States, they can have a green card. And of course, they need to pass background checks, level 2. Of course, you can do that, the classes, the training, but if you don't pass the background check, then unfortunately, we won't be able to take you as a volunteer. Why? Because our volunteers handle sensitive information like Social Security, birthdays, income information, and we don't want to take the risk that our information, that the community information or taxpayers' information goes around and we have an issue then. And of course, the commitment has to be 4 hours per week. We always said you can volunteer anytime. We have a, location that they work Monday through Sunday, some locations during the day, some locations during the night or weekends. And then, of course, in the second slide, we have the trainings. We have United Way use the process-based trainings where we integrate the tax law and the practice on hand on the software. This is very good because we talk about tax law, and then everything that we learn about tax law immediately will go to the software to show you how to enter the part that we talk about in tax law. Let's say filing status or the income. Everything is talking, and then on hands on practice. This is a very successful training. Our volunteers, especially beginners, we have 4-day training every day for hours. And of course, the last day is just for testing. This is when we do the trainings, we always encourage them to ask questions. It's open book. And we always said 4 days is not enough to have practice in how to prepare a return. But we give you the tools, and we have, coordinators. We have people that can help you to go through. You can shadow an experienced volunteer in the first days, and then you can do on your own. And if you're not sure of something, we said, you can ask. You can ask to an experienced volunteer. You can ask to the coordinator. Even to us, if you're not sure of, if the coordinator is not willing to give you the right information or is not sure, you can go to us and we found an answer for you. If we don't have it, we're going to get it for you. That's one thing. And that's why, United Way has been very successful in that. We have a retention of, between 60 and 70% every year. We always recognize our volunteers when we go to a site to visit how they're doing. We ask questions. We always, willing to listen to them if they have any concern. And of course, we always say, thank you so much. We have a recognition event at the end. And I think, our program is very rewarding. We have so many clients, in the last few years, we have 10,000 clients. And of course, having 160 volunteers is a lot, means a lot for us, means a lot for United Way, and I think for the community, and of course, when the people, they have to pass a certification, that's a very important part, like I said, the basic one, or could be a refresher, returning volunteer, that is normally professionals or experienced people, is 4 hours. We just do updates on tax law pretty much. They don't need too much about the software. There is a few changes, small changes. We explain to them, but that's it. And then, of course, they need to complete the standard of conduct, that is a form where it says that they agree, to follow the standards of the program, And of course, after that, if they pass the certifications and, of course, the background check, we assign to a location. And this is pretty much, and of course, we want our volunteers to be recognized, and willing to come back again the next year. And they can be involved on other volunteer opportunities that United Way has for them. We have a few of them that come back during summer. Even we have during summer, we have year-round tax preparation in a couple of locations, or the other opportunities that we have. And of course, the most important thing is to motivate and incentivize our volunteers at the end and, feel recognized for them. And of course, if you have any other questions, please, let us know how I can, share some information with you.
And one of the things I will say about this particular program, the training is very extensive because they do need to be able to pass those tests in order to be able to volunteer for this program. So Vivian and some of our site coordinators are kind of the top-notch experts. And so they are able to provide this really intensive training that these volunteers need. And then again, that increases their knowledge and enables them to be able to perform the tasks that they're assigned to. And a lot of the volunteers, as Vivian had mentioned, are skill-based volunteers. And I know a lot of you probably use skill-based volunteers in your programs. And so this is a great example of that. We have, like Vivian said, teachers, CPAs. So they're providing those skills that they already have to the program. And as Vivian said, kind of going back to Gary, some of those more skill-based are mentoring some of our other volunteers and helping them along the way with any questions or things that they might have an issue with or need help with. So, and then I will say too, with both programs, especially with COVID happening, we've had to really adjust to online, virtual, which seems to be working out very well. And so a lot of our mentors and mentees are meeting through virtual platforms. We'll be doing some virtual drive-through type opportunities with the Volunteer Income Tax Program this year. And then I will also mention on Gary's mentoring program to really have a effective program. You must follow some national guidelines through National Mentoring Partnership. And all of the volunteers have to go through the 6 elements of effective practice. And so I'll let Gary really quick before we turn it over to Megan, just tell you what those are really quickly, because it's a really important component. But really, you can kind of intertwine some of those things, I think, into other programs that you have as well.
Yeah. Elements of effective practice is a guidebook to help mentoring programs decide and choose what really makes a program quote unquote quality. These standards are put out by National Mentoring Partnership, and it walks you from all the way from how a mentor enters your program to how they exit your program. So it's really designed to understand how you're going to A, recruit your volunteer mentors, B, train and give orientation to your volunteer mentors. How are you going to match your volunteer mentors with a mentee? How are you going to monitor that match with your mentors and mentees? And what does success or match closure look like for your volunteer mentors and mentees? So it literally walks you through what is the ideal prospective mentor for your mentees, all the way through what success looks like when a mentor finishes your program. And sometimes they may finish your official program, but they're still technically mentor and mentee long after the program closes. They're lifelong friends, and they remain close for years after the program officially closes. So for some programs, mentoring, the success looks like the kid graduates from high school and they go on to a post-secondary education. The next one may be that the young lady doesn't have a subsequent teen birth in high school and she goes on to college. So success looks very different for every mentoring program, but it's all based upon those elements of effective practice of what makes a mentoring program and a mentor-mentee relationship strong. And you can find those on National Mentoring Partnership's website at mentoring.org.
Awesome. Thanks, Gary. There are a couple other mentoring questions under the Q&A. I don't know if you'd like to take those now, Gary, or if you wanted to wait till the end. Definitely your choice.
Whatever's easiest. I'm open. Do we have time now? Donna, what do you think?
Sure, I think we can take a few questions now.
Okay. Let's do it. So, what were some of the other questions?
I see under Q&A, we have a trial period for your volunteers for a brief time to ensure they are a good fit for your mentor program.
There's not really a trial period, but we do have things in place to make sure a mentor will become consistent. So one of the questions that we ask at the very beginning of a mentor relationship, even before the mentor is matched, or even before they come to a training, is, can you make a one-year commitment to a child? That is one of the first things we ask. And years ago, we used to just try to find anybody who was willing to be a mentor and just really try to have that trial period. But we don't want that now, because ultimately what we see is anything that happens under 6 months, if a mentee is matched and the match closes before 6 months, then it actually does more harm than good for the child. So we have lots of different things in place to make sure the mentor is going to be consistent. So asking if they could be matched with at least a year with a child, making sure they call us back when we call them, making sure that they respond to emails and that they're prompt and they show up to dates for training and orientation. So there's lots of different things in place that we have to make sure that they're going to be consistent to when we do match them with the child. We don't have to worry too much about them being consistent and really following up on their commitments with that child. So that's one of the things we really try to hammer in, is making sure that we do a lot of those things before they actually get matched with the child. Good question.
And the other question I saw, Gary, says, do you house personal identifying information on secure site, or do you outsource background checks and fingerprinting? That may or may not be different for VITA, I don't know.
Yeah, another good question. And what we get, so when we do the fingerprint check, what happens is we send that information off to FDLE. There's a secure site that we log into through FDLE, and it houses all the information there in their personal site that we have a login, username, and password to get into. So we don't keep anything on our personal site on United Way's end. It's all housed through FDLE's personal website that they give us access to.
Okay, and with that, we will move on to disaster recovery and preparedness. So unlike mentoring and skills-based volunteer programs like VITA, who have the time to take to orient and train their volunteers, and our programs that need to expect from their volunteers that there will be an extensive training period in order for the volunteers to be successful, disaster volunteering happens very quickly. So disaster volunteers are unique because you don't need them until something happens, and then you don't have a lot of time to orient and train them. But by using knowledge, well, by prioritizing really knowledge, skills, and attitude, you can increase both your agencies and your volunteers' knowledge of the whole disaster cycle in order to increase your readiness. This will lead to an increased impact in the community because volunteers' attitudes will change and they will be able to more successfully work within the cycle. So as you can see from the slide and in your handout as well, the disaster cycle is not linear. So one of the greatest challenges is figuring out where your agency is going to fit into this cycle and deploy disaster volunteers. Volunteers will come out in droves when something happens, but by then it's too late to train them properly. They need to get out in the field as quickly as possible. But if you can back your viewpoint up, your perspective up from the disaster cycle and not focus only on response and include preparedness in your volunteer program, you can use that period before something happens to more effectively orient and train your volunteers so that they are ready to respond when you need them. Now, again, with the nonlinear nature of the disaster cycle, another challenge presents itself in that it's more difficult to engage volunteers during preparedness because it feels like nothing's going on. There's nothing exciting to help with. So how do you keep them active so that they actually answer the phone when you call and something has happened and they're needed that afternoon to respond to their community? One key tool to help with this is to create some sort of tracking system or database of your volunteers. So if they help with one disaster, you can still call them and engage them for future disasters. A great example of that is, excuse me, our current disaster volunteer tracking database includes volunteers from 3 disasters now in South Florida. We kept our list from Hurricane Irma in 2017, and then Hurricane Dorian hit last fall in 2019, and we've also been recruiting volunteers to help with things like food distribution events and virtual activities during the pandemic. So combining those 3 lists, now we have about 600 to 700 volunteers who we can call and ask to help when we need them. So if you look at the slide, again, the beginning of the disaster cycle is that preparedness phase when we are creating efforts to mitigate the effects of a potential disaster. United Way of Palm Beach County does a lot of training during this phase. And we do preparedness activities like supply drives to help our vulnerable citizens have the resources they need when disaster hits. Then during response, we're not a first responder, but we call ourselves one of the many second responders who, after life and property has been deemed safe, can go in and close the gaps in services for the community. And we do that through volunteers and donations, both in kind and financial donations. And we do that in coordination with county emergency management in order to centralize that process. And then when we move into recovery, United Way of Palm Beach County serves on the long-term recovery coalition so that we can be a part of addressing any additional unmet needs in the community and can help understand where additional volunteers will be needed and can help with that shift of volunteer roles from more of the emergency food and water distribution to, say, rebuilding homes and schools in the community. So an example of increasing skills in disaster volunteering is using the Volunteer Reception Center. This is usually a physical place, though really we've been running kind of a virtual volunteer reception center throughout the pandemic to help deploy volunteers throughout Palm Beach County. But it is a place where volunteers can go to get oriented on what the current needs are in their community, what agencies need their help, what they need help with, and get at least some training before they are deployed out into the community. The Volunteer Reception Center serves as an excellent central location to organize unaffiliated volunteers, these spontaneous volunteers who show up and want to help, and you haven't been able to engage yet in during that preparedness phase of the disaster cycle. So it helps with the safety of the volunteers and making sure that volunteers are deployed to where they are actually needed in the community. So you both need volunteers to run the volunteer reception for you, volunteer reception center for you, and then you need to be able to process potential volunteers, members of the public who want to go out and deploy. So training folks to run the volunteer reception center is an excellent engagement opportunity for the preparedness phase of the disaster cycle. And now we're in response, and you have to get people out to deploy out to the community. So members of the public will come in and they will fill out an application. They will let us know if they have any particular skills, like a medical degree, or can drive heavy equipment like a backhoe, things like that. So you can incorporate skills-based volunteering into your disaster volunteering as needed throughout your community. And then they'll take that application and have an interview to determine the best volunteer opportunity for them, both based on skills and I recommend based on the location of the volunteer as well. This is a post-disaster environment that you're working on, potentially less than a week after, say, a hurricane has hit. So you still may have electricity issues, you still may have road closure issues, et cetera. So Palm Beach County, for example, is huge geographically. If someone is based in the southern part of the county, even getting physically to the volunteer reception center may be difficult for them. You don't want them to have to drive another 20 miles just to volunteer. They won't come back, and you will have lost a valuable asset. So that interview is meant to really match the volunteer appropriately, in much the same way you would match a mentor with a mentee. The volunteers then do get a brief safety training, just to understand the basics of the environment that they will be going into. And then they will be badged and given directions to the site that they are assigned to, so that the site coordinator there knows to expect them and knows that they have been vetted through the volunteer reception center. At that point, the volunteer is free to go. This process should really only take between 30 and 45 minutes, for someone to get vetted through the volunteer reception center, because again, you've got a disaster going on. You got to get them in the field as quickly as possible. And they're sent to the site where they are deployed and where they are needed. Any additional training that the volunteer needs to help run a shelter, help walk the dogs at the local animal control, help with debris removal in a community, is the responsibility of the agency requesting the volunteers. So another important part of running a volunteer reception center is really using that preparedness part of the disaster cycle to create and form relationships with agencies who you expect are going to need help post-disaster, and ask what their training needs are, what their orientation needs are. You don't want an hour-long lecture about the wonderful work of United Way, waiting for volunteers who really just want to help muck and gut a house. So those relationships will enable a smoother orientation and training process, and you may even be able to incorporate some of that into the volunteer reception center structure. There may be an opportunity to do some just-in-time shelter training before they leave the volunteer reception center. But again, that's all part of planning before something happens. Once something happens, you're in it. You got to go with the systems that you already have in place. So the volunteer reception center quickly deploys, orients, and trains volunteers, and it educates volunteers in order to prevent what we call the disaster within a disaster, which is the really, really good-natured volunteer who drives clear across the country to Palm Beach County and shows up and says, "I'm here to help, put me in, coach." But there's no housing, there's no food support, et cetera, and you spend so many of your resources dealing with them instead of getting them out into the field and getting volunteers where they need to go. So that knowledge piece of how the system works and how people can successfully maneuver through that system is really important in your community. So donation management is a great example of that disaster within the disaster. Donation management, as well as people, stuff can quickly become a disaster for you. So if you haven't taken the time to really teach your donors and your volunteers how to be good stewards and good donors, you're going to end up with a warehouse full of stuff 5 years from now that nobody needed, and you have nowhere to put it. And so focusing on that knowledge about, cash is best, but if in-kind donations are requested, if diapers and baby formula is a huge need in your community, how can you then quickly deploy volunteers to help with supply drives? And again, you can begin this work during preparedness. So donation management has both a pre-storm and a post-storm component. So if pre-storm, you've already engaged volunteers, helping pack, sort, distribute emergency preparedness supply kits, they're already trained in that model of donation management. So then you can bring them back in really quickly post-disaster, once you get a requested list of items that your community needs. And you can adapt quickly to those changing needs. The first week after a disaster, it's going to be diapers and baby formula, but that's going to quickly change into bigger and more expensive items like tools and sheetrock and nails and rebuilding supplies. And so how can you have a flexible donation management system, and how can you support your volunteers to maintain that flexibility and continue to meet the need of your community? So that is just one example of pulling together, supporting your volunteers and making sure they have the knowledge and understanding of what the disaster cycle really looks like. They have the skills they need to be successful out in the field. And they come in with the right attitude to want to create the biggest impact in their community, not just to be there to be there. With that,
thank you, Megan. So any questions for Megan?
I do see one in
Or
the
any
chat.
other questions in the chat?
I do see one that is asking about each other.
Yeah, I see one about, do you partner with Team Rubicon and other disaster relief agencies, and how do those systems work together? Yes, great question. So United Way of Palm Beach County, we actually serve as the emergency support function, or ESF 15 lead agency with our county emergency management, which is volunteers and donations. So our job on the agency level is to create those relationships with disaster relief partners like Team Rubicon, like Salvation Army, Red Cross, Samaritan's Purse, all these agencies that are out there and are nationwide, and start those relationships now while we're in preparedness before something happens, so that when something happens, we can very quickly mobilize them and mobilize their volunteers. So a great example of Team Rubicon right now is up in the panhandle of Florida. Escambia County is dealing with recovery from Hurricane Sally. And Team Rubicon, they've been in communication with Team Rubicon. ESF 15 up there has been in communication with Team Rubicon. And they've got the volunteers recruited, they're ready to move in, but they need housing. So then there's been a request to the community of Escambia County who can help with that housing piece. So the great thing about organizations like Team Rubicon is they understand this danger of self-deployment. So Team Rubicon offers help to a community and has a conversation with them, and they do not come into the community until they are given the green light by the community and that they have everything in order. Because if Team Rubicon were to just show up in Escambia County right now, they'd have 30 volunteers and nowhere to sleep that night. And then the, excuse me, the EOC, the Emergency Operations Center in Escambia County, has to stop everything while they're working on 100 other missions to find these guys and gals housing and some, a warm meal before they go to sleep. So plan now so that you can flip a switch and they can come when called, and have the conversation about not self-deploying now. Do all those things now is really the answer.
And one of the other things that I would add is the recruiting and the training of the volunteers. We have a huge AmeriCorps group in our county. And so we train them every year on how to help us run that volunteer reception center, how to help at some of the special needs shelters in our community. So again, anything you can do like ahead of time to build those relationships and those partnerships, so that you have it in place when something happens and you're not scurrying to try to pull that all together. Were there any other questions?
Not questions, but Irene has a really great comment. She says, we are trying not to have a possible massive amount of spontaneous volunteers by doing a city communications blitz constantly for them to volunteer through volunteer organizations now, like Volunteer Florida and Team Rubicon. Exactly. So you're using that planning phase, that preparedness phase, to get the spontaneous, the unaffiliated volunteers affiliated with someone now. So they're trained and they're oriented in that organization's mission, and they're ready to deploy when something happens. And this is a Volunteer Florida convening, great opportunity to plug Volunteer Connect for Volunteer Florida. That's a huge resource for disaster volunteers, and you can see statewide what the needs are, and how to help and what skills are needed, et cetera. Another great question. Does United Way of Palm Beach County do any simulations or practice runs as it relates to disaster preparedness? Great question. Again, through our role with the county, we as an agency do participate in county-wide exercises, like for the nuclear power plant. If that were something awful were to happen there, the plan is for folks to evacuate to Palm Beach County. So how do we handle that decontamination process? That's really an interesting event to participate in. And then we do, as Donna said, we do volunteer reception center training. We also created an interactive simulation that's kind of like the Oregon Trail meets a Choose Your Own Adventure book, where small groups can go through a scenario of a hurricane that's bearing down on Palm Beach County, and you make decisions to prepare for the storm, how you're going to respond to the storm, and then about 48 hours post-storm, how are you starting to figure out your recovery? And that simulation is based on a family profile that a team is given, and you work through that in small groups. That simulation started as an internal staff meeting, and it's been really well received in other venues as well. So just starting that conversation and having people understand, how many decisions need to be made, and that you really can't make these decisions at the last minute.
So it looks like we're just about out of time. So we hope that this was helpful for you. We think those elements of effective practice that Gary mentioned can really relate to pretty much any volunteer program that you have. Our contact is up on the screen. So if you do have any questions moving forward, you can reach out to any of us. And we hope that the handouts that we've shared as well will be helpful. So we thank you very much for your time, and we hope you have a great day.
All right, thank you. And I hope everyone will join me in giving the United Way of Palm Beach County a virtual round of applause. As they presented today, it was so wonderful to see your wide range and variety of volunteer programs. So just a few housekeeping tips. Please complete the session survey. It can be found on the event tab in the attendee portal. And we are going to lunch. So we hope that you packed something or are at your house and your kitchen is ready to make you something delicious for lunch and that you get a little bit of a technology break. But we will see you back at 1:30 p.m. Thank you.